April 6th, 1945. East China Sea, off Okinawa. Dawn breaks over Task Force 58 of the United States Fifth Fleet. On radar picket destroyers stationed 16 miles from the main fleet, sailors scan the horizon, fully aware of what is coming. In the Combat Information Center of USS Lee, radar operators track incoming contacts, not dozens, but hundreds. 5-inch gun crews load shells marked with the cryptic designation VT. Each shell contains a miniature radio transmitter, a revolutionary technology that would forever change naval warfare. The goal is desperate: to survive Operation Kikusui No. 1, the first of 10 massive coordinated kamikaze attacks. At 0600 hours, the sky fills with aircraft. Through the morning haze comes a sound that will define the Battle of Okinawa, the drone of hundreds of Japanese engines approaching in relentless waves. Pilots sit sealed in their cockpits, with no intention of returning. Leading the assault are aviators of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Special Attack Units, Zero Fighters, and Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, each carrying 250-kilogram bombs, followed by waves of older aircraft pressed into suicide service. Among them are specially trained Oka pilots, strapped into rocket-powered flying bombs, carried to launch range by Mitsubishi G4 M Betty bombers. What happens next will demonstrate the revolutionary power of America's proximity fuse technology and reveal why the kamikaze, initially so devastating, would ultimately fail against the most sophisticated anti-aircraft system ever deployed. The American VT proximity fuse had reached the Pacific Theater after 2 years of intense combat testing, beginning with a single historic shot. Developed through a crash program launched in 1940 by Section T of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory under Dr. Merle Tuvey, the proximity fuse was considered one of the 3 most critical secret projects of World War II, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. Its principle was brilliantly simple: a miniature radio transmitter receiver built into the nose of each shell emitted continuous radio waves, then measured their return frequency. When a Doppler shift indicated that a target was near, the fuse detonated the shell automatically. For the first time, gunners no longer needed to calculate distances or set mechanical timers with precision. The shell itself would know when to explode. The technical challenges were staggering. Each fuse contained tiny glass vacuum tubes manufactured by Sylvania that had to survive the unimaginable stresses of naval gunfire. When fired from a 5-inch gun, a shell experienced 20,000 times the force of gravity, accelerated to 2,600 feet per second, and spun at 25,000 revolutions per minute through rifling. After such a violent launch, every component had to function flawlessly, and continue to do so in temperatures ranging from 100 degrees to minus 50 Fahrenheit. By April 1945, American factories had produced more than 15 million proximity fuses for naval use in the Pacific. Production had been spread across multiple contractors. The Crosley Corporation alone manufactured 5,259,913 fuses, nearly a quarter of the total. RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris joined with 87 other companies across 110 factories to meet demand. This enormous industrial effort ensured that the U.S. Navy entered the Okinawa campaign with the most advanced anti-aircraft ammunition ever created. The Navy's allocation of VT ammunition had grown rapidly. In 1943, proximity fuses made up just 25% of the anti-aircraft stockpile. By 1945, they represented 3/4 of all 5-inch shells fired at incoming aircraft. This was a recognition that only revolutionary defensive technology could counter the kamikaze onslaught. Meanwhile, Japan's kamikaze program emerged from sheer desperation. Following devastating defeats in the Marianas and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Navy had lost most of its experienced pilots and nearly all of its carriers. In October 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed the creation of special attack units, arguing that conventional tactics could no longer succeed against overwhelming American firepower. The math seemed brutally logical. Conventional airstrikes achieved hit rates of barely 2% against heavily defended American ships. Early kamikaze attacks in the Philippines, however, had success rates exceeding 34%. A single pilot flying a worn-out Zero with a 250-kilogram bomb might cripple or sink a destroyer, trading one life and one obsolete plane for hundreds of American casualties and millions of dollars in warship damage. But the reality behind these numbers was grim. The kamikaze pilots underwent abbreviated training that focused more on spiritual preparation than on flying skills. Many had logged fewer than 100 hours in the cockpit compared to the 500-plus hours of their predecessors at Pearl Harbor. They were taught only the basics of navigation, ship recognition, and the final diving approach intended to evade anti-aircraft fire. Before their missions, the young men wrote farewell letters, shared ceremonial cups of sake, and received rising sun headbands or samurai swords. Yet no amount of ritual or spirit could protect them from the technological revolution they were about to encounter. The ultimate embodiment of the kamikaze concept was the Oka suicide weapon, a manned flying bomb nicknamed Baka, Fool, by American sailors. Each carried a 1,200-kilogram warhead and was powered by 3 solid-fuel rocket motors. Once released, it could dive at 575 miles per hour, theoretically unstoppable. But its fatal flaw was range, barely 10 miles. The Oka had to be delivered into launch position by lumbering Betty bombers, which became easy prey for American radar-directed fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The contrast between offensive and defensive philosophies was absolute. American ships deployed in concentric rings of defense, with radar picket destroyers posted far ahead to give early warning and absorb the brunt of initial attacks. Each destroyer carried 12 to 16 5-inch guns, all loaded with VT shells, their fields of fire overlapping into deadly curtains of steel. The proximity fuse had transformed the 5-inch gun from an area denial weapon into a precision instrument. Each shell's lethal burst radius was 70 feet, compared to just 20 for conventional time-fused ammunition. More importantly, the fuse eliminated the need for complex calculations, enabling gun crews to engage instantly upon detection, regardless of the target's altitude or maneuver. The morning of April 6, 1945, would put this system to its most brutal test. Operation Kikusui, Number 1 began with terrifying scale. On April 6, 1945, Japanese forces launched 391 Navy aircraft and 133 Army aircraft. Of these, 215 Navy planes and 82 Army planes were designated kamikazes, a total of 297 suicide aircraft in a single coordinated assault. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton of the destroyer USS Laffey later described the incoming waves as a swarm of bees heading for the only flower in the desert. The first wave struck at 0600 hours. Radar operators tracked more than 50 aircraft approaching from the north. The radar picket destroyers opened fire at maximum range, 12,000 yards, with proximity-fused 5-inch shells. The results were devastating. Each shell that passed within lethal distance of an aircraft automatically detonated, shredding targets with steel fragments. Unlike conventional time-fused rounds, which required near-perfect range estimates, the VT shells turned near misses into lethal strikes. Within minutes, dozens of Japanese aircraft were spiraling into the sea. Their missions ended long before reaching the main fleet. But the attacks did not stop. At 0744, USS Laffey came under one of the most concentrated kamikaze assaults of the war. Over the next 80 minutes, 22 Japanese aircraft dived at the ship. The destroyer's gunners fired 345 rounds of 5-inch VT ammunition, destroying 9 attackers outright. The proximity fuses allowed gun crews to engage multiple aircraft in rapid succession, switching between targets without delays for mechanical fuse setting. Kamikaze pilots attempted their classic low-altitude approach, flying at wave-top height to evade radar, but even here the VT shells proved deadly. The fuses detonated when shells passed close to the sea surface, creating fragment walls that obliterated low-flying attackers. Despite this firestorm, Laffey was struck 6 times by kamikazes and 4 times by bombs. Miraculously, she survived, saved by her crew's damage control, and by the dozens of attackers destroyed before they could hit home. The effectiveness of the VT fuse was no accident. It had been tested in combat as early as January 5, 1943, when USS Helena fired the first proximity-fused shells in action off Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Red Cochran, commanding a 5-inch battery, shot down a Japanese Val dive bomber with the second of 3 salvos. The shells detonated not on direct hits, but when they passed close enough to the aircraft, tearing it apart with fragments. That single success validated 3 years of development and proved the fuse's revolutionary potential. Each device contained about 130 electronic components, all miniaturized to fit into a casing smaller than a pint milk bottle, and all built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. By the Okinawa campaign, this technology had matured into an industrial miracle. Post-battle analysis confirmed its mathematical superiority. Traditional time-fused 5-inch shells required an average of 1,162 rounds to destroy a single kamikaze. Proximity-fused shells reduced that number to 310 rounds per kill, a nearly 4-fold improvement. Under optimal conditions, the difference was even more striking. The destroyer escort USS Abercrombie downed a kamikaze in May 1945 with just 2 VT rounds. On May 4th, USS Morrison shot down 8 attackers in minutes with proximity shells before sheer numbers overwhelmed her. For Japanese pilots, the psychological impact was harrowing. Survivors who aborted missions later reported the nightmare of flying into what seemed like solid walls of explosions. The distinctive black puffs of VT detonations appeared with uncanny accuracy, as if American gunners could see precisely where each aircraft was headed. Japanese tactical doctrine had assumed that high-speed, low-altitude approaches minimized exposure to anti-aircraft fire. The proximity fuse invalidated these assumptions completely. Shells that would once have missed by 50 feet now detonated lethally close, turning the kamikaze's final approach into a gauntlet of fire. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, directing kamikaze operations from Kyushu, recorded in his diary the growing disaster. By late April 1945, Japanese naval intelligence estimated that fewer than 1 in 4 kamikazes were reaching their targets, compared to 1 in 3 during the Philippines campaign. The decline was blamed on what Japanese reports called new-type anti-aircraft shells that seemed to explode with impossible precision. Ugaki wrote bitterly, "The enemy's defensive firepower has increased remarkably. Our special attack aircraft are being destroyed at distances we previously considered safe." Individual American sailors and gun crews soon became legends within their task forces. On USS Hugh W. Hadley, during the massive attack of May 11th, gun crews claimed 17 confirmed kamikaze kills in a single day, most destroyed with proximity-fused ammunition. The Hadley's 5-inch batteries developed a technique of continuous fire, creating a wall of VT that incoming aircraft were forced to fly through. With a firing rate of 15 rounds per minute, each shell carried its own electronic brain, detonating automatically when close enough to a target. For nearly an hour, the Hadley's gunners cut down one attacker after another, until sheer numbers eventually overwhelmed the ship. The destroyer, USS Aaron Ward, faced a similar ordeal on May 3rd. Attacked by 40 kamikaze aircraft, her 5-inch batteries fired continuously for 52 minutes. 6 attackers were destroyed outright, and 5 more were damaged so badly that they crashed into the sea. Commander William Saunders later testified that without proximity fuses, Aaron Ward would have been sunk within the first 10 minutes. The ability to engage targets without exact range finding allowed her guns to shift rapidly between aircraft, something impossible with conventional time-fused shells. Such accounts were repeated across the fleet. During the 10 major Kikusui operations from April 6th to June 22nd, 1945, Japanese forces launched approximately 1,900 aircraft in organized kamikaze missions. Thanks largely to proximity-fused 5-inch fire, hundreds were destroyed before ever reaching American ships. Operational research showed that vessels equipped with VT ammunition were 3 times more likely to survive concentrated kamikaze attacks than those still relying primarily on conventional rounds. The proximity fuse had transformed a terrifying tactical innovation into a costly but survivable threat. American forces refined their tactics continuously. They discovered that VT shells were especially effective when fired in overlapping patterns, creating spheres of fragment bursts. Ships began to coordinate their barrages to form VT boxes through which kamikazes had to fly, often with fatal results. Japan, meanwhile, could only attempt tactical variations. Some kamikaze squadrons attacked at dawn, hoping to use the rising sun for cover. Others tried multi-axis approaches or mixed suicide and conventional strikes to overwhelm defenses. None of these adaptations could overcome the fundamental advantage of shells that knew when to explode. Behind the scenes, America's industrial machine told its own story. By June 1945, factories were producing 70,000 proximity fuses every day. Over the course of the war, more than 22 million fuses were manufactured at a cost of over $1 billion wartime dollars, roughly $15 billion in today's currency. The Crosley Corporation alone employed 10,000 workers, operating 3 shifts, 7 days a week. The investment paid off. By Navy estimates, proximity fuses saved dozens of ships during the Okinawa campaign alone. Japanese industry, devastated by resource shortages and strategic bombing, could not match such production. Though Japanese scientists were aware of the concept, having received reports from Germany, their war-ravaged factories lacked the capacity to produce the precision vacuum tubes that made the VT fuse possible. Even Japan's radar development lagged far behind. The Type 22 radar, their most advanced naval set, operated at wavelengths too long to support miniaturization. Even if Japanese engineers had grasped the principle of proximity fusing, their industry lacked both the materials and the manufacturing precision to produce it in quantity. By May 1945, the consequences were clear. Kamikaze pilots were ordered to begin attacks from maximum altitude, diving vertically in a desperate attempt to minimize exposure to VT fire. But this change was counterproductive. High-altitude approaches gave American radar more time to track incoming aircraft, and warships could maneuver out of their dive paths. Accuracy plummeted. In trying to evade proximity fuses, the kamikazes made themselves even less effective. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of amphibious forces at Okinawa, later admitted, "Without the VT fuse, our losses from suicide attacks would have been unbearable. The Japanese kamikaze was a formidable weapon that could have changed the outcome of the Pacific War, if not for our technological superiority in anti-aircraft defense." His view was echoed by Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of the Fast Carrier Task Forces. His flagship USS Bunker Hill survived a devastating kamikaze strike on May 11th, partly because proximity-fused fire destroyed 3 other attackers that might otherwise have finished off the crippled carrier. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Mitcher's chief of staff, later reflected, "All of our 5-inch ammunition was fitted with VT fuses. Those fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. Without them, our losses would have been enormously greater." The impact of the proximity fuse extended far beyond statistics. It struck at the very heart of the kamikaze doctrine. Japanese military leaders had calculated that the certainty of a pilot's death would be balanced by the near certainty of hitting an American ship. But when success rates fell below 20% due to proximity fuse defenses, The brutal calculus of suicide warfare no longer worked. For many young pilots, the realization was crushing. Letters recovered after the war reveal that some understood their deaths would likely achieve nothing. Early kamikaze leaders like Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who had led the first official suicide unit in October 1944, had inflicted devastating losses in the Philippines when only 25% of American anti-aircraft shells carried VT fuses. By Okinawa, his successors faced an entirely different battlefield, one where their sacrifice was almost certainly futile. Lieutenant Commander Goro Nonaka, who led the Thunder God Corps equipped with Oka flying bombs, saw his entire squadron destroyed on March 21, 1945, before a single weapon could be launched. 18 Betty bombers, carrying 18 Okas, were intercepted and shot down by American radar-directed fighters long before reaching range. Even had they broken through, the wall of proximity-fused fire would have destroyed them. The VT fuse was not just a triumph of manufacturing, but of science. Each fuse contained vacuum tubes built with special glass formulations capable of withstanding enormous shock. Its battery system, activated by the sudden acceleration of firing, used a stable electrolyte that remained inert for months, then activated instantly when needed. Its radio frequency was carefully chosen to minimize interference while maximizing detection range. Every element reflected years of focused research, backed by seemingly unlimited wartime resources. Japan's anti-aircraft defenses, in contrast, remained primitive. Their best heavy gun, the Type 98 100mm, still relied on mechanical time fuses set by hand before each shot. When the super battleship Yamato sailed on her final sortie against Okinawa in April 1945, she carried ammunition technologically no different from what the U.S. Navy had used at Pearl Harbor in 1941. On April 7th, more than 300 American carrier aircraft attacked Yamato. Her 162 anti-aircraft guns fired thousands of shells but shot down fewer than 10 attackers. The Americans lost just 10 planes while sinking the largest battleship ever built, a stark demonstration of technological disparity. The proximity fuse also enabled tactical innovations. American destroyers developed the VT umbrella technique, firing shells in preset patterns above friendly ships. The shells detonated automatically, creating a protective dome of fragments through which kamikazes had to pass. This tactic proved especially effective against the Oka, whose 575 miles per hour dives made them nearly impossible to track with conventional fire control, but vulnerable to fragment walls created by VT fire. Over the course of the Okinawa campaign, from April 1st to June 22nd, 1945, the U.S. Navy fired approximately 150,000 proximity-fused 5-inch shells. Though VT ammunition represented only 45% of heavy anti-aircraft fire, it accounted for the majority of kills against kamikazes at long range. Conventional time-fused shells, which still made up 55% of rounds fired, proved useful mainly at close range where accuracy mattered less. The numbers told the story. VT shells were 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional ones. Ships that ran out of proximity ammunition and reverted to time-fused rounds suffered dramatically higher casualties. The destroyer USS Drexler, attacked on May 28th after exhausting her VT supply, was struck by 2 kamikazes and sank in less than a minute, losing 158 men, more casualties than many destroyers suffered during entire campaigns. Even high-ranking officers were not immune to the kamikaze threat. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, had his flagship USS Indianapolis hit in March. Forced to transfer to USS New Mexico, he witnessed that ship struck by a kamikaze in May. Reflecting afterwards, Spruance wrote, "The suicide plane is a very effective weapon which we must not underestimate. Yet the VT fuse has saved countless ships and lives. It is the margin between bearable and unbearable losses." For planners of Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of Japan, the lessons were critical. Japanese stockpiles included an estimated 10,000 aircraft reserved for suicide attacks. Yet with VT production scheduled to reach 100,000 units per day, by September 1945, the Navy was confident it could defend the invasion fleet. More than 1 million VT shells would have accompanied the landing forces, creating an anti-aircraft defense unprecedented in history. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before that test came, but captured Japanese assessments after the surrender revealed that their leaders had already concluded proximity-fused defenses made kamikaze attacks untenable. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, admitted that Homeland Defense calculations had predicted success rates of less than 10% against the American fleet. By their own admission, the tactic was militarily worthless. Post-war analysis revealed the full scale of the proximity fuse achievement. The program had mobilized 112 companies in addition to the primary contractors, creating an entire industrial ecosystem dedicated to producing the most sophisticated military electronics of the era. British scientists had originally conceived the idea of a radio proximity fuse in 1940, but lacked the resources to develop it. They concluded that making vacuum tubes survive the launch from a high-velocity gun was impossible. American engineers proved them wrong. The proximity fuse's success influenced the development of smart munitions for decades to come. Modern anti-aircraft missiles use proximity fusing principles descended directly from the VT fuse, while the Phalanx close-in weapons system aboard U.S. warships operates on concepts first pioneered during the defense against kamikazes. In many ways, the VT fuse was the ancestor of all guided munitions, the first weapon that could, in a sense, think for itself. Japanese veterans interviewed after the war expressed astonishment. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who had helped organize early kamikaze units, admitted, "We knew the Americans had superior technology, but the proximity fuse was beyond our imagination. Our pilots reported shells exploding exactly where they flew, as if guided by invisible hands. It destroyed not just our aircraft, but the very idea that spirit alone could overcome material disadvantage." Captain Eiichiro Jo, an early advocate of the kamikaze strategy, later reflected, "We believed that the willingness to die would guarantee success." The American electronic fuse proved that technology could defeat even the most determined human sacrifice. It was not just a weapon, but a statement about the nature of modern warfare. The contrast between proximity fuses and kamikaze tactics revealed two fundamentally different philosophies of war. The United States invested in technology to preserve life, relying on science and mass production to protect its sailors. Japan, unable to match that technological advantage, chose instead to expend human lives as weapons. In practice, the American approach not only proved morally superior, but also militarily decisive. The legacy of the proximity fuse extended into the post-war era. The crash program that had produced 22 million fuses established a model for later American technological achievements, from the space program to modern computing. The collaboration between universities, private industry, and the military, pioneered by the Proximity Fuse Project, demonstrated an organizational capacity that became a defining feature of American power in the Cold War. The Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, where the fuse was perfected, continued after the war as a center of innovation, developing guided missiles, satellite navigation, and other advanced defense systems. Dr. Merle Tuve, who had led the fuse program, reflected years later, "We saved lives by making weapons more effective. Every kamikaze shot down by a proximity fuse meant American sailors who went home to their families. That was worth any effort, any expense." For Japan, the failure of kamikaze tactics against proximity fuse defenses was a shattering lesson. The belief that spiritual determination could overcome material weakness collapsed in the face of technological reality. The thousands of young pilots who died in futile suicide attacks became symbols not of noble sacrifice, but of the tragic consequences of leadership that ignored science and innovation. In the decades that followed, Japan's national emphasis shifted toward technology and industrial development, a path shaped in part by the bitter lessons of 1945. The cold mathematics of the proximity fuse's success was undeniable. Time-fused shells required 1,162 rounds per kill. Proximity-fused shells required only 310. This 73% increase in efficiency translated into saved ships, saved lives, and ultimately strategic victory. Each properly functioning fuse meant a kamikaze destroyed before reaching its target, and another group of American sailors who lived to return home. The final accounting of Okinawa was sobering yet decisive. During the campaign, Japanese kamikaze attacks sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 others. Nearly 5,000 American sailors were killed, the Navy's bloodiest battle of the war. Yet these losses, terrible as they were, represented only a fraction of what might have occurred without proximity fuses. Conventional analysis had predicted far greater devastation. Japanese losses, by contrast, were catastrophic. Over 1,900 aircraft and pilots were expended in the 10 organized Kikusui operations, with hundreds more lost in improvised suicide missions. These sacrifices inflicted damage, but failed to achieve the strategic aim of halting the American advance. The proximity fuse had turned the kamikaze from a terrifying new weapon into a manageable threat. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal summarized its importance. The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device has given the fleet, our push westward could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. The fuse's contribution was more than tactical. It validated the entire American approach to 20th century warfare, investment in technology, faith in industrial production, and belief that superior equipment could overcome even the most determined enemy. The kamikaze pilots, brave young men sealed in cockpits for one-way missions, flew into electronic defenses that nullified their sacrifice. Their courage could not change the mathematical reality. Each VT fuse weighed less than 5 pounds, contained 130 electronic components, and cost just $18 by 1945. Fired from a 5-inch gun, it functioned for less than 30 seconds, yet in that time it could destroy an aircraft and its pilot, representing years of training, tons of material, and a life that could never be replaced. Multiplied across thousands of engagements, that equation spelled victory for the United States. By the end of the war, proximity fuses had prevented the loss of dozens of ships and thousands of sailors. They proved that in modern naval warfare, survival depended on the ability to destroy aircraft at distance. Nations that could design, mass-produce, and deploy such technology held decisive advantages over those who relied on human determination alone. At Okinawa, electronic intelligence defeated human sacrifice. The proximity fuse had beaten the kamikaze, the divine wind, and in doing so, it reshaped the future of warfare. It demonstrated that in the crucible of modern conflict, technology, not spirit, determined survival. The Pacific War thus closed with a stark lesson. Courage, even when bound to certainty of death, could not overcome science, industry, and innovation. In the skies over Okinawa, when the miniature radio brain of a VT fuse met the human resolve of a kamikaze pilot, the outcome was decided by laboratories in Maryland, factories in Cincinnati, and an American belief that the lives of sailors were worth protecting through technology. This was the final legacy of the proximity fuse, a device that turned the tide of battle, saved untold thousands, and proved that in modern war, advanced technology would triumph over even the most determined human sacrifice.